Okay, welcome fellow AP language teachers. So before I launch into this, I'll just preface this. So I'm gearing this as an FRQ3 for the AP language exam, just as a practice to do an argument essay. But I know that a lot of other English classrooms do something similar to FRQ3s, just basic straight up argument. This will serve you well, and I'm using this as an introduction to argument. So I'm sure you could fine tune it and twist it around a little bit to have it serve your needs for your students if you were to do this at like a 10th, 11th, 12th grade general ed level. I know that argument is typically the domain of language, but I know that a lot of curriculum across the country is starting to include it as they move away from being so literature centric. So for this one, I'm looking for a breath of fresh air and am going with Mr. Rogers. So I know that this year in particular, things have been a little rough for our students and even us. So looking to spread a little joy, and Mr. Rogers is always a go-to source for me. I think he was one of the best teachers of all time. So also look for a video that I will post later on using a Bob Ross quote. So I thought I'd go with two of my favorite teachers, Bob Ross and Mr. Rogers. So in this one, I'm going to tackle Mr. Rogers though, and walk you through how my templates can be incorporated and manipulated to construct an entire FRQ3. And the other thing I'll say is I don't like to do a lot of straight up test prep with my students until about the month of March. I like to create my own assignments and keep it loose, keep it fresh, but pedagogically edifying as well. So you'll see that my prompt here in a second is worded just like you'll see on the AP language exam. So here is the prompt. So it says, over the course of history, in a variety of contexts, the following quote from Mr. Rogers has held a great deal of truth and at times a certain degree of fallacy. When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. So that looks pretty similar to something you might see on the Lang exam. And the other thing that I did with this is I'm going to have contrarians in my class. I always do. I have those existential kids that always focus on something negative in a prompt. They're just that caliber of kid. So if they want to disagree with this quote and take historical examples, perhaps, or examples from literature, film, pop culture, then it's in their wheelhouse. They can do that. So most kids are going to spread some joy on this, though. So write an essay in which you argue and explore the nature of this claim. Use appropriate evidence from your reading, experience, or observations to support your argument. So you can see here, I tried to keep it as College Board-esque as possible. So in order for my templates to work, I always emphasize this, that you got to Bob Ross your instruction. So position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom and provide your students with plenty of models and exemplars. So what I mean by Bob Ross your instruction is this. When Bob Ross would open up an episode of The Joy of Painting, he would say things like, all right, happy little people, today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge, right? So he wouldn't pass out graphic organizers and say, fill it out. And then, God willing, that will transfer into a good essay, which, as we know, seldom does. He would proceed to paint at the canvas and the easel with us. And even if we could barely, ineptly hold a paintbrush, we can closely approximate what he's doing because he's guiding us through the process. So what I'm going to do right now for you, and you could use this video for your students even if you wanted to, is paint on the canvas. I'm going to show you plenty of models and exemplars of how to declare and invert the thesis. Those are the two templates I used for the introductory paragraph. And then I'll show you a few syllogistic body paragraphs, which is my other template for the bodies. So, you can use these examples, but it's always a good idea to write your own as well when you're doing your writing workshops. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is this: how do I write the introduction? And as I already alluded to, you can declare or invert the thesis. So when you declare, look at my arrow here, you begin with the thesis. So in this prompt, we really have to focus on the idea of helpers. So I would tell my students, in your thesis, the one word you want to have is helpers. That's the main idea of the prompt. So you can begin with your thesis, and then the other things that I look for in every introductory paragraph is tier 2 level vocabulary. I like it when my students get out of the gate with a strong academic tone, and even extra pizzazz points if they could blend it with some, spunky vernacular or colloquial to balance that all out for the voice point. And then I look at sentence constructs, and I have videos in the channel for this. So some vocabulary exercises, and then the sentence constructs, I focus on Strunk and White's principle of the idea that there are 12 different ways to write a sentence. So you're going to see my students are pretty good at manipulating their syntax in order to achieve voice rhythm and flow. And as I said, I have several videos in the YouTube channel that basically gamify that instruction so that it's not straight up academic, boring kind of stuff. I gamified it and made it into a competitive, collaborative team effort in the classroom. So that's a lot of fun. So check that out. And then here's the kicker. So every introduction, while the scaffolds are in place for the declarative and the inverted, are going to be 4 sentences long. So I want them to be exactly no more, no less than 4 sentences long for the introductory paragraph. So if you invert, you're going to end with the thesis. So thesis is either on top or on bottom, and then the same concepts, tier 2 level vocabulary, so like good SAT level words, sentence constructs for voice rhythm and flow, and then exactly 4 sentences. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. And you'll see here that in every single one, my students are going to say helpers. It's really hard to get a thesis without saying helpers. And then I tell them, don't get into your textual support and your textual evidence yet. That's going to be for your body paragraph. So you won't see my students do that. And then you can just kind of show your cards a little bit, front load where your body paragraphs are going to go. So a little context and background. So let's break down one together. Morality and helping go hand in hand. In many ways, morality creates social groups that yield things such as tribalism, genocide, war, and even more basic than that, politics in and of itself. As history has shown many times, the helpers are not always altruistic heroes destined for sainthood. Conversely, once history can write its past, these so-called helpers are actually some of the most evil and nefarious figures to have ever lived. So clearly we got a contrarian here, right? We got the kid that's going to go bleak and dire on us. So, kind of belied the thesis with the air quote helpers, right? And then this is inverted. They're ending with the thesis. And I like it. The sentence flow is really nice. So you have this short, simple declarative sentence. And then this next sentence with the commas and the hyphen is really nice for flow. And then you just have a medium length sentence. And this is nice. Conversely, comma, right? And then off you go. So some adjective clauses and things of that nature. The tier 2 level vocabulary is up there. Nothing over the top. The kid stays in his lane with things like tribalism, genocide. I like that. Altruistic. Sainthood is nice. Nefarious. So they have some nice tier 2 level words in here. But you can see the kid has some spunk and some flair by keeping it academic with this little sidekick of casual as well. So I like to see my students do that. So it doesn't matter, thesis up top or thesis at the bottom, 4 sentences long, tier 2 sentence constructs. And in this prompt, kids can definitely disagree with Mr. Rogers as this kid did. So here's another one. For whatever the reasons, altruism is not an innate disposition. So that's not a thesis statement. That's context and background. So I'm expecting the 4th sentence to be the thesis. Let's see what happens. But for many, however, they are born to be helpers and can give them the heart with ease, from the heart with ease and at will. I didn't read that very well. Let me do that again. But for many, however, they are born to be helpers and can give from the heart with ease and at will. So I told my guys, you have to say helpers, right, in order to have a thesis. So we're getting there. Let's keep moving. These are the historical figures who could turn dire and dark moments into ones of goodness and grace. Stretching over centuries, history has shown over and over again that humanity can always rely upon its helpers, even in the face of evil. So here's another kicker with this. I kind of told my guys, because I modeled this for them, I Bob Ross my instruction, it's really hard to have a thesis without saying the word helpers. So that was kind of a guardrail for them. I said, hey guys, in your thesis, you probably got to say helpers. There's no way to really avoid that. So that's what you're going to see my students do. And this proceeds just like the first one in terms of how to manipulate the template. It's inverted, so context and background, and with the thesis, tier 2 sentence constructs. Great voice rhythm and flow out of the gate. This kid is off to a blazing start, and they are going to argue the side of Mr. Rogers, and they showed their cards. They're going to go the route of history in this, which is totally fine. So that's probably where most kids are going to go for their textual support. So here's another one. The human tendency to have an insatiable appetite for possessions has blunted many a person from being altruistic and even moral. In essence, and history has shown us this countless times, there are basically 2 factions to humanity. Those that want everything for themselves and those that want to help out their fellow man. Look at the complexity of that sentence. Man, oh man, I love it. Even in the most grim of times, there has always been the helpers. When push comes to shove, the goodness and grace of mankind always trumps the evilness of greed and corruption. So again, doing the same thing. Now, 3 out of 3 have been inverted. And here was something else I discovered when I was writing my models and exemplars for my students. Found it really hard to do declarative theses for this. It just seemed to flow better through inversion, and my students found that out to be the case as well. So typically, struggling and emerging writers find it easier to declare because it ensures that they at least have a thesis, and that's half the battle for the introduction, right? Get the thesis point. So not too many of my students went the route of declarative. So here's the last one. To be a helper may mean nothing more than this: to turn one's back on the status quo and do what the soul is demanding within that particular moment. So this was the closest one I had out of a class stack to a declarative, but see where it goes. These are the ones ruled by a higher conscience who are the real trailblazers of history and humanity. Instead of standing by watching the world do wrong, helpers seize the moment and turn wrongs into rights. Ever since man has been able to walk upright, history and culture has presented us with countless examples. So it's kind of like a quasi-declarative and inverted. So sometimes they look like a diamond instead of a triangle. And that's totally fine as well. Just got to get the thesis. But all 4 of these went 4 sentences. Sentence constructs were really fluid and supple. Tier 2 level vocabulary. And the thesis used the word helpers in it. So you got to focus on helpers. So with College Board prompts, I always tell my students, like, look at the key words, look at the main diction, and get your thesis anchored in that main concept. So it's really hard to get a thesis without saying helpers, right? I've said that a couple of times. So that's an easy training wheel for your students as they write this paper. Just say, hey, thesis, drop the word helpers in there. So the next question students might ask, or you might ask, is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you're going to say, holy cow, this guy's not lying. You can always go syllogistically, and that's the bingo of my templates, is that no matter the expository mode, no matter the essay, every single time these kids write, they can bust out syllogistic body paragraphs. You just have to get anchored in the expository mode so that you're meeting the demands of the assignment, and the rest of the rules follow. The template never changes. So you guys that have seen my videos for like literary analysis or synthesis, you'll see that nothing really changes here except the fact that the first premise is not going to use rhetorical terms and or devices, because we're not doing rhetorical analysis. And the first premise is not going to use literary terms and devices. It's just going to be a straight up argument. Every expository mode is an argument. So in literary analysis, you argue with your terms and devices. Rhetorical analysis, you argue with your terms and devices. But this, the textual support is coming from the kids' heads, from their noodles, right? From their brains. So it's just a straight up argument, which we'll look at in a second. So for those of you that are new to my template, let me give you a brief overview of the syllogistic method. So it comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn the art of oration, polemics, debate, and then of course the math and the sciences. So oftentimes they'd have these debates that would go on for days. And maybe you've read Plato's Republic, where the essential question of what is justice gets thrown out, and all these philosophical think tankers step to the podium and say, this is what justice is. And each definition is a syllogism. And then they huddle up and say, no, there's flaws in that syllogism. Let's offer a different definition. And the book goes on and on and on, trying to define the exact nature of what justice is. And they realize it's kind of a futile, subjective pursuit that is, germane to the individual and not this objective, authoritative law. So Aristotle said one day, I have figured out what my best orators are doing. They are arguing syllogistically, and this is why they systematically win debates. And he defined it for his students, and he said, hey guys, man, it's as simple as going premise, conclusion. Let me give you an example. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. It's a truth statement. It is. We know that. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. So therefore, we're going to naturally conclude my dog is going to die. It's bulletproof logic. It's sustained logic. In AP language, AP literature, we talk about the line of reasoning. This sucker right here is cogent, right? And what I mean by that is it's lockstep logic. There's no deviation. It's very mathematic. It's very scientific. It's very bulletproof. And when our kids write, we want them to sustain that line of reasoning. It's very important. So if we can kind of twist this up a little bit and make it into a writing template, it's going to look like this. So the first premise is going to be an argument that offers a why reason. Up top in the thesis, you're basically going to agree with Mr. Rogers, disagree with Mr. Rogers, or you can qualify. So those are the rhetorical positions you can take. So the first premise is going to offer a why. So why are you agreeing with Mr. Rogers? Why are you disagreeing with Mr. Rogers? Why are you qualifying Mr. Rogers? Right? So the first premise is always going to be 3 sentences long. And the reason I necessitate that is for the following reason. The College Board, and I make this true for even my gen ed students, The College Board says your argument must be central for the synthesis paper, but all expository writing is argument. So I make that rule tacit for everything: lit analysis, rhetorical analysis, persuasion, synthesis, and straight up argument. Your argument must be central, so take 3 sentences to set it up so that your reader knows that it's your argument. And then in particular for synthesis, you don't want to, doggedly grab or borrow or steal a thesis from one of the sources, right? So for this paper too, it's got to be your argument, and you just can't start with your textual support. Otherwise, you're writing plot summary and not argument. So the second premise starts in the 4th sentence, and it begins your textual support. And students can use anything they want: pop culture, music, movies, history, personal experience, whatever they really want to support and defend their argument. You'll see for a prompt like this, a lot of kids go culture and history for this. I actually told them not to write about themselves because we're practicing. And sometimes when they write about themselves, they sound too teeny bopperish for my liking. I want them to be academic, and this one really lends itself to some choices that are pretty rife with interesting ideas that show the kids have good noodles in their heads and that they're active, alert, and aware and intelligent. So the conclusion of the syllogism, and mind you, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay. The body paragraph has a conclusion. This is called a syllogistic body paragraph, is where the textual analysis comes, and it's the links. So you got to link it back to the word helpers because that's the thesis. And then the first premise I call a promise. So you got to shake hands back with that first premise and say, haha, I kept my promise. I promised you that I was going to argue this. All my textual support is germane to that argument, and I'm just wrapping up. So students ask me this all the time: Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. So if the introductory paragraph is 4 sentences long, what are you looking for in a syllogistic body paragraph? And I tell them, shoot for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12. So you'll notice when students get into the second premise, they're talking about things that they're really interested about. Sometimes it's their passion. Sometimes it's the things they know a lot about. And they want to go on and on and on and on. And we'll get body paragraphs that are like 23 sentences long. It's just too much. The goal is to write an argument, not some plot summative, cliff note or something of that nature. So nice and tight. Shoot for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12. So let's look at a couple. These are ones that I wrote as I Bob Rossed my instruction. And teachers often ask, how do you know that students won't steal from you? Well, I'm taking textual support that they absolutely know nothing about. So I'm going to talk about, in this body paragraph, the Fort Fisher hermit, who's a historical figure that I'm sure they don't know, they've never heard of before. And then in my second body paragraph, I'm going to talk about Jules Berglé, who was also known as the Leather Man. So they can't steal these, right? They don't know anything about these. I'm just modeling. So the first 3 sentences are going to set up my argument. So look how I do this. The basic chemistry of how contemporary society functions has a number of entrapments that most people are blind to. Most people are like lemmings and just blindly blend into the status quo and follow along. But history has given us a handful of helpers who have shown us alternate paths upon which to live a life. So if the first premise is a promise, my second premise needs to present a character in history, so a historical character that broke from the status quo, who maybe is, the round peg, square hole kind of person, right? But breaks free. They break free from the entrapments of society. So let's make sure that that line of reasoning is upheld with all the textual support that is offered here. So I tell my students, you're shooting for 10 sentences, so you can't exceed 12. And then for the conclusion of the syllogism, you need a couple of sentences usually. It usually takes 2 sentences, 3 sentences. So you're playing around with about 6 sentences here, maybe 7. So don't go on and on and on. Don't prattle, don't bloviate, don't go wayward. Keep it focused, line of reasoning. So then you just have a transition in the 4th sentence that begins the 2nd premise. And look how I did this. One such man is Robert Harrell, also known as the Fort Fisher Hermit. And then give some context to him, but keep it germane to the first premise. In 1955, after having suffered several psychiatric breaks, he decided to turn his back on the world and live alone in the marshes of North Carolina in an abandoned World War II bunker on the beach. So even though we're out of the introduction, still focus on the tier 2, still focus on the sentence constructs, right? Voice, rhythm, flow all the way throughout. So look at some of these sentence constructs. Philosophically, Harrell realized that the American way of life was pretty stupid and hollow when one breaks down the blueprint for how a life gets constructed. He pointed out that the American child goes to school for almost the first 2 decades of their life to learn what are mostly useless things. So I got to talk about the status quo. I'm talking about the status quo because that was my promise. And then I'm going to have to talk about how the Fort Fisher Hermit broke from the status quo. And then from there, most go on and do higher education so that they can specialize in a field that earns them a job that relegates them to a 9-to-5 life. Most Americans dutifully work that 9-to-5 for nearly 40 years of their life, and they are in turn miserable, unhappy, and unhealthy. So I'm out of space here. It's going to continue on to the next slide. One works 5 out of 7 days, and then the weekend is a mad sprint to go wastefully spend money one doesn't even have. So now I got to wrap this up here. I really got to promise my first premise here. Harrell stopped dead in his shoes one day and said, "This is so messed up." So I was teaching my kids a little bit about colloquialism and using the vernacular. So I'm using things like messed up. I said stupid, but my vocab is high in other places. That's one thing I like my students to do to achieve voice, is not overdo the colloquial and the vernacular, but every now and then, if the tier 2 is elevated. So once he became a hermit, he developed a new philosophy that he called common sense. Thousands of people would come to his bunker to learn about his teachings. In time, Harrell became the 2nd largest tourist attraction in North Carolina. So now I'm at the conclusion of the syllogism. It's just like the thesis. You got to go back to the thesis. So I told my students, training wheel, training wheel, training wheel. Drop the word helpers in here, and that way you've echoed your thesis and have kept the promise of your first premise. So to go back to that second promise, everything's super connected to the first premise, right? I had to talk about the status quo in a historical figure that broke from the status quo. And that's exactly what I did. All my textual support is within that line of reasoning. Robert Harrell is a crucial helper in that he inspired people to truly examine their lives instead of simply being blind sheep. His teachings changed a lot of lives. By being so far out of society's box, he will go down as one of America's most unique and authentic helpers. So you can see there, end with helpers. You begin with helpers in the thesis, you end with helpers in the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph. So everything's got to go back to the prompt, everything's got to go back to the thesis, full circle. Arsenic is deadly, my dog ate arsenic, my dog is going to die. Keep it that lockstep when you're right. So students ask, what do I do next? And the answer is, bust out another syllogism. This is the beauty of this. You never have to change the template. So I'm just going to change my second premise, and by default, my first premise is going to change, but it's going to be 3 sentences to set up that centralized argument. 4th sentence begins the second premise. I got about 6 sentences, 7 sentences to elaborate on my textual support. And then the conclusion, I'm going to echo the thesis and keep the promise of the first premise. So look at how I do this. In moments when hearts get broken and the loss of a lover crushes one's soul, the helpers tend to be on standby. So you can see here, always focusing on the helpers in my transitions. So if I'm going to stay germane, I'm going to talk about broken hearts here and people that help broken hearts. That's what my second premise has to be about for the line of reasoning to stay intact. The end of a relationship can really devastate someone, and it is in these times when emotions get rocked that the helpers offer their solace and comfort. So notice there, I brought to the attention of my students, I said the word rocked in an essay. And they're like, you can do that? And I'm like, yeah, like you're spunky, you're 16, right? Show that you got pizzazz, show that you got flair. As long as you can rock good tier 2, you can bust out some colloquial every now and then. It's a good way to get voice. Historically, some of these helpers have taken on the role of being some unusual characters. So I need a character right now who's unusual, who is a helper of broken hearts. So all of my textual support needs to be about this one person who's a helper of broken hearts. Let's transition again. Take, comma, for example, comma, Jules Berglet, also known as the Leather Man. So my students are transitioning like that in the fourth sentence always. From roughly 1857 to 1889, he walked a circuit between the Connecticut River and the Hudson River. This might not seem altogether unusual, but his reasons for doing so are: Jules fell hopelessly in love with Margaret Lebrun, a French woman of a higher social standing. Berglet asked Margaret's father for permission to marry his daughter, and he said yes under one condition, that Jules resurrect his failing leather business. Right at the advent of the Industrial Revolution, there were two choices: change with the times or hope that the new fads would fade out. Jules bargained and stuck to the traditional methods, and the business went belly up. So there's my colloquial again. But pay attention to all the other tier 2, pay attention to those sentence constructs. Like that needs to be worked on. And again, check out the videos on my sentence constructs and vocab, because you can teach this, and kids can definitely wield it in their essays. Margaret's father, as a result, forbade the marriage. Forlorn and heartbroken, Jules clad himself from head to toe in leather scraps and walked that circuit for years, a loop that was perfectly symmetrical in that it took him exactly 30 days to walk 365 miles. He did this as an act of penance and in the hopes that God would bring Margaret back to him. So now I'm at the conclusion. I have to say helpers, and I have to talk about those broken-hearted people, right? Because I got to keep the promise. The Leather Man is a reminder that one need not ever give up on love. True love is eternal, and his life story helps ease broken hearts because he is a perfect example of never giving up. Berglet is like a walking Valentine who helps, you see, you got to focus on helpers, the brokenhearted to see that they never ought lose faith. And then I'm done, right? I'm hovering around 10, 11, 12 sentences, and that's it. So that's how the template of the inverted, the declarative, and the syllogistic works. So I've said this in a number of videos and in the in Facebook posts, but Tim Freitas and I, that awesome dude from Garden of English, and I are sitting down to write a textbook together in the coming months. And that's one of the reasons why I'm being so active in the groups and my YouTube channel, is so that all of you have a sense of what I'm doing, since Tim is so prolific and shares a lot. I gotta come out from underneath my rock and kind of show what I'm doing so that that textbook makes sense. So one of the things I've done over the years is I offer courses to teachers. So we work together in small groups. I call it the Mastermind. We meet Sunday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for 5 weeks. I also do PD with districts and departments. So if you want to work with me in any capacity, then reach out. And if you want any materials to accompany this writing workshop or anything else, so I have the PowerPoint, and then I have a printed handout of the prompt. So if you want the PowerPoint to host your own writing workshop, or the PowerPoint to host your own writing workshop in the prompt, to anchor your students, just email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. If you need anything from the other videos that are in the YouTube channel, again, reach out. Any general questions, I'm here for you. So don't mind sharing my knowledge at all. So I hope this is useful and that your students enjoy it. For now, happy teaching and happy writing.